Hi everyone, welcome to the podcast tutorial. Since this is our first digital storytelling tutorial, we're going to spend a little time creating some folders to help you keep your work organized. In order to create a folder, navigate to your desktop, right-click, and click on New Folder. Call this first folder Digital Storytelling. This is where you're going to keep all of your projects for the semester. Inside that folder, go ahead and create a folder that says Final Products. Because of the way that you have to save your work, it's important to have a separate folder for this so that it doesn't get mixed up with all of the other files you're going to be saving in these folders. Once you've created that folder, go ahead and create a folder for the specific project you're working on called Podcast. Now we're going to go ahead and go inside that folder and create some more folders. You can go ahead and click on it, and then over here on this side, click New Folder. Now we're inside the podcast folder, and in here we're going to want to have an audio folder and a folder called Sequence, or Sequences, I guess. The Sequences folder is where you're going to actually save your project, and the audio folder is where you're going to put all of the audio files that you recorded on your phones. It may be tempting to skip this step, but you're going to find you'll have a way easier time working on these projects if everything is organized correctly. Once you've created your folders, go ahead and navigate to your files that should be saved on Google Drive. If you haven't yet taken the files from your phone and put them on Google Drive, pause this and do that now. When you do have your files there, you can navigate to them, highlight all of them by holding down Shift on your keyboard and clicking one at the top and then at the bottom, or either way from the bottom to the top. Then you're going to want to right-click and click Download. Now this is going to zip the files so that you can do it all at once, and that's going to take a little bit of time, but when it asks you to leave the site, go ahead and click Leave, and that will download them down here. Now you want to make sure that your files are actually where you want them to be, so click on this arrow and then click Show in Finder. And now here you can see that they're actually automatically saved to your Downloads folder, which is not where we want them to be. So we have to move them to the folder that we want. In order to do that, the first thing you're going to do is right-click on the file, click Open, and then Apple's going to unzip that into its own folder. Click on that folder, and then here's all of your files. So now minimize all of your Google Chrome windows, and that should bring you back to the desktop. Now you've got your download folder over here and your digital storytelling folder over here. So highlight all of those files. I just clicked and dragged my mouse to do that. And then drag them over to the digital storytelling folder. Keep holding that down, and then hover over the podcast folder, and then one last time hover over the audio folder until that opens up over here, and then you're going to release your mouse, and there's all of your files in the audio folder. Now that we have all of the files we need to make our podcast, we're finally ready to get started editing the files and putting it together. So now open up Premiere down in your dock here. If you can't see your dock, you'll want to hold your mouse down at the bottom of the screen until it pops up. Click on Premiere and wait for it to load. Once Premiere has loaded, you'll see a lot, and it can be easy to be overwhelmed by all of the options here, but just use this tutorial and follow along and you should be okay. Navigate over here to where it says New Project, click on that, and then we're going to decide what our project will be called. You can just call it Your Name and Podcast 1, or you can call it whatever you'd like. That's what I'm going to call mine. But more importantly is where you're actually going to save your podcast. So you want to choose that now so that you don't get lost. Where it says location, click on Browse, and then you're going to browse to your podcast folder, Digital Storytelling, Podcast, and you're going to go into your Sequences. Now Sequences is where you'll save your project folders in all of your projects. So click on that and click Choose, And then once you're named it correctly and you've got your folder, click OK. And now you're ready to go. The next thing you'll see is the main Premiere workspace. Again, a little overwhelming, but just follow along. You're going to go down here where it says Import Media to start and put your files into the program so that it knows those are the ones you want to use. Double click here and then navigate back to that podcast folder. Now you want to get your files from your audio folder. So click on all of them at once. You can click and drag, or you can click on one and then shift and click on the another and hit import. That will bring them into the Premiere program so that you can use them. Once you have your files imported, you're going to want to drag them over into this space, which is your timeline. That's where you'll do all of your editing of your files. So hopefully you've labeled your files so that it's very easy for you to know which ones you want to work with. Here I have podcast 1, which is the beginning of the story. So I'm going to click that and drag it over to the workspace. Now it doesn't really matter where you put it, but it's important to note that this is a timeline. So wherever you place it, that is when that file will play in time. So right now it's placed kind of at 10 seconds, but this is the beginning. So I want to drag it all the way to the beginning of the timeline so that when I hit play,
for me, the smell of popcorn is the smell of home.
That's the first thing that we hear. If you look over here, you'll see V1, V2, and V3. That's only used for video, and since we're making a podcast, it's going to be easier if we actually get rid of that. So click right in between the video and audio parts when you see this symbol and drag up, and then you'll only be able to see the audio parts of the timeline. Adjustment you can make to make things easier to see is to go over here to this zoom bar and drag that out so that your audio is filling the entire space here. That just gives you a little bit more to work with. You can also, since we're not dealing with video, pull this up as much as you want, really. You don't need any of that stuff at the top, and that just gives you more space. One last adjustment, and actually grab this zoom bar and pull that a little bit closer. This podcast will only be about a minute in length, so I'm going to drag it somewhere around here, and then you can see it goes from 0 to approximately a minute. You can adjust these zoom bars as many times as you want, and whichever way makes it easiest to see, but doing it like this might help you see that, okay, I need to fill this amount of space in order to get to that minute marker. Now we're going to put the rest of our files into our timeline. Since we already have podcast 1 right here, the next thing we're going to put is podcast 2, or whatever your next part of the story is called, and then podcast 3, right next to podcast 2. Now, if I was going to do nothing else, if I just hit play, that would essentially be my podcast, because the entire story would be told. But there are a couple of things and requirements that you know you need that we need to do before we can say we're finished. So, the hardest thing to do is to decide where your B-roll footage is going to come and how many spaces and gaps you're going to have in your storytelling in order to reach that 1 minute requirement. Thinking about where your B-roll footage goes is going to be difficult, but a good way to do it is to continue to listen to your podcast and think about when you're editing in Premiere, you're going to want to check what you're doing over and over again, but you don't always want to do it right from the beginning. So use this blue playhead to go exactly where you'd like to listen. Just click and drag it to the area, and then you can hit play,
A giant bowl of
and you can hear what you're doing. Move that wherever you'd like.
this camping.
Now also, get to know this playhead because Premiere is going to use that kind of as a guide for where you're placing sounds. For instance, let's say I put these outside night sounds in here. If I move it over here, you'll see it kind of snaps to where that blue playhead is. This is a really good way to line things up precisely where you want them to be. So for instance, let's say
Sometimes we take
I want that sound to come in as soon as Miss Ralph says sometimes. I'll move the playhead to where she says sometimes, and then I'll move the sound there.
Sometimes we take the popcorn with,
and then you can see that those are exactly aligned together. Now I could show you how to edit the entire podcast, but for time's sake, I'm just going to show you an example of one piece of B-roll footage, And hopefully you can use that to make decisions about how you mix, balance, and edit your own B-roll. I'm going to get rid of this outside nighttime sounds file, and instead I'm going to focus on the beginning of the podcast. The line at the beginning is, for me, the smell of popcorn is the smell of home. And I've decided that I want the sound of the popcorn maker that will be so important later on to play right at the very beginning, even before Miss Ralph starts speaking. So I'm going to take the popcorn maker B-roll file over here, click, and now I'm going to actually place it underneath the speaking file above. So you can see that these are called layers. You have audio 1, audio 2, and audio 3. You can add more layers, but you probably won't need to. So layering your audio makes it so that you can hear multiple files of audio at once. So right now, if I leave it as is, we're going to hear Miss Ralph speaking, we're going to hear her speaking all the way up to here, and we're going to hear that popcorn maker underneath all of this. I don't want the popcorn maker to play that long, so the first thing I'm going to do is reduce the amount of popcorn maker sound there is by clicking at the end of it and dragging all the way just so that it fits the beginning of Miss Ralph's first audio file. So now it's going to stop here. And you can click it back out if you make a mistake or if you want to adjust it even more, you can do that. But for right now, I'm just going to leave it right there. Now, if you go and hit play now,
For me, the smell of popcorn is the smell of home.
You'll notice that the sound of the popcorn machine is way too loud. So the easiest way to fix this is to take this line here, which actually represents the volume of each file, click and drag that way down so that this, the voice file, is louder than this. Now you're going to have to test this to make sure that it sounds right.
For me, the smell of popcorn is the smell of home.
But that's a basic volume balancing adjustment that you can make. I think what you'll find, though, is that that basic adjustment probably isn't going to be enough for what you really want to do. So actually, what I'd like is for the popcorn sound to be louder at the beginning and then get quieter as Miss Ralph's voice comes in, because I think it's important to actually hear the popcorn sound. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to create keyframes along this sound so that we can have volume that's up here at one point and then that dips down a little bit later on. This can get a little bit tricky, so follow with me. Adding a keyframe to your volume line tells Premiere that you want to change the volume at that point. So navigate to the point on the timeline that you want to make the change, and then click this diamond to add a keyframe. You'll notice that when you drag that, it's going to move the entire line. So you actually need to make 2 keyframes in order to make a change. So I'm going to put that one there, and then now I've moved slightly over, and I'm going to click add another keyframe, and now you can see you have 2. Now when you drag them, see what happens is that these act as anchors. The first one is holding that first part of the volume line up here, and the second one is holding and bringing down that volume line here. What that's going to do is it's going to make that popcorn machine louder in this area and then dip down when Miss Ralph's voice comes in. Now, you're going to have to start learning to read these waves. These waves are when sound is happening. I know that this is the sound of Miss Ralph's voice, so this is where her voice comes in. So I'm going to take this bottom dipped down anchor and I'm going to move it to where, just about where her voice comes in. I actually want the popcorn to be louder before that happens. I'm going to bring this up about up here and now see what happens when you play that, how the sound dips when her voice comes in.
For me, the smell of popcorn is the smell of home.
The last thing I want to show you is the cut tool. In order to get the cut tool, you can either click here or you can hit C on your keyboard. What this does is it lets you take entire sections of your audio out if you'd like, or to move them to an entirely different location. So let's say I didn't want this middle part of this file. I would click 2 times and create 2 lines, and then I would select that middle portion and hit delete, and now I've gotten rid of that file. This is going to be very useful when you're arranging your audio and getting rid of things you don't want, shortening, reducing, whatever. Now, there's a lot more you can do, but combining all of those techniques will help you create a great podcast.